fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. I hope that you are staying at home, staying safe, maintaining social distance, and are weathering this exceptional circumstance that we find ourselves in. And you're spending your time listening to this podcast on architecture in the time of coronavirus. We're trying to have a series of conversations with provocative thinkers from around the world to see how they're responding to and how they're thinking about what the implications of this condition are for their own lives and for architecture. Today I'm talking to my good friend Mark Wigley from Columbia University, who has a very unique and critical way of looking at the world. He's very good at showing a different perspective on things that are familiar, on defamiliarizing them and presenting them in a new way. Today is no exception, and he helps us see coronavirus in a very different way. I also wanted to note that in our third year of this podcast, we have now crossed 100,000 unique downloads. 100,000. For a simple academic podcast, I'm quite excited by this milestone. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy today's conversation as well. Here we go. Mark, welcome to Architecture Talk. Thanks so very much for doing this. Been following your work, having conversations with you for so long, but it's so fantastic to be able to actually sit down and just have a chat.
Same for me.
Yeah. One of the great virtues of this pandemic, if you like, is that I've actually been able to connect with a lot of people whom, normally you are trying to set up appointments and figure out a lecture and this happen, make that happen. But here we are, and I can simply, it seems like since we are all stuck at home, it's always to respond to these. How are you doing? How are you doing? At home? Yeah. You're in New York?
Yeah. Well, we could start with this first thing that you said, that we are all stuck at home. Yeah. And a couple of things that brings to my mind. One is, of course, the lockdown. We are all stuck actually in the same home. That's why you and I can chat, because we are now in basically one interior space.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of almost obligatory domesticity, right?
Yes.
So the lockdown is not just, let's say, each of us locked down in our respective isolated domestic spaces. Almost the opposite. We are locked within a single domesticity, which is also of space and time, right? Because we are more or less 24 hours in this space. There is no longer any distinction between a home and not home. There's only home.
There's only home.
And also, I love your expression, stuck at home, because maybe that's a definition of what home is, the place that you are stuck in, So it's not so much ever that we live at home, but we are stuck there. Like any teenager would tell you, they feel
grounded. Yeah.
And of course, we are still, you and I, repressed teenagers. We still feel somehow stuck. So I think that there is of course something domestic here for Beatrice and I. We are in our loft downtown in New York. So in theory, we're at the very center of the outbreak. But on the other hand, that's why we live in this city. We dream of such things.
I dream of this. You're being stuck in your loft in the middle of the.
Well, in some ways, I think also about the fact that we are scholars, you and I. So actually, we like to be stuck inside, and we fantasize that we are a little bit disconnected from the world, and we think that this disconnection allows us to talk about the world. And so we are teachers in universities, which are also places that are somehow disconnect from everyday life, not because we are disinterested in everyday life. Let's say the opposite. We are thinking how to talk about it, how to engage with it. So universities somehow are like these kind of valves. Now you disconnect in order to reconnect. Our students do this because they disconnect to be with us for a while and then they reconnect. But we also continually disconnect and reconnect. And now this happens, let's say, in this one shared home. There's even, let's say, a set of rules about how to behave in the home, which come from father figures. And these father figures are like all father figures,
ghosts everywhere.
Yeah, and they're a bit scary. And stuck at home means to be stuck in this other way. So I think all of these things, which of course make the situation enormously interesting and absolutely minute by minute fascinating, even what you and I are doing now, because there is a kind of confessional mode also. Everybody has to somehow, as we do with family, report on the everyday details of an everyday life which is perhaps more similar now than ever before. Perhaps the rituals of, who knows, but it's possible that we are all becoming a bit like synchronized swimmers. So in other words, as we report, we all more or less report the same thing, and this could happen also, by the way, in the discipline, perhaps architecture discipline. Let's say architectural theorists might all be saying more or less the same thing about the pandemic at the same time. It could be a moment of a spectacular lack of innovation and creativity. It's possible.
Are you talking about the sort of, let's say, broad, almost unquestioned acceptance of all the norms of social distancing and general surveillance society that we are all sort of acceding to and pushing and accepting?
Yes.
As what is now architecture? Architecture has become a 6 feet magic number, and a kind of a defragmentation of the city into your individual units. I'm not hearing anything different from architects so far.
Yeah, because they can only see what they have been trained to see, and of course there is, let's say, a 6 foot dimension is being mapped onto the physical world in a way that's super interesting. But I would say it's super interesting not because it's different. The entire physical world is mapped with so many dimensions which have the force of law, at least social law and convention. So in a certain way, it's a kind of coming out of the architecture discipline. Let's say even you can see written on the streets and on the floors of supermarkets and so on, are the kinds of things that architects supposedly have in their head all the time.
Right.
And I have these two very strong feelings. I don't know if it's the same for you, Vikram, but for me, on the one hand, it's clear it's not business as usual, precisely because of the lockdown, because of this sort of synchronization, and maybe, for example, it is perhaps a moment of kind of uncertain or uninteresting production by architectural scholars, and that might seem exceptional because I think generally actually it's a pretty interesting field. Right now it may not be, and so in many, many ways there's this constant declaration that things are not the same today, and also a kind of related claim that things will be different in the future. And I really think that this is these two claims are uninteresting, that everything is different and that the future will be different, because isn't the first instinct that it's not business as usual, that we are not going to business as usual, carrying out our business? Isn't the second thought even more impressive, that it is business as usual? And I use as my evidence that the deaths from the pandemic are so closely related to social inequities. Yeah. So it's absolutely business as usual in the double sense. It's the same thing is happening, the same people are paying the price, and you could say, and they pay the price in the name of business. Let's say probably you and I would share the idea that nobody is poor by accident, that this is very carefully structured in such a way that a small number of people benefit from a very large kind of pyramid. And so so in a way what we see right now is just a very clear picture, let's say, of architecture, because of what we said before, the markings on the street, but also of inequity, and of structural inequity. So I would say there are these two claims. Yes, everything seems, it's not business as usual. Immediately comes the second claim, but it really is business as usual. So
it's kind of an X-ray. Kind of like a X-ray as exaggeration and clarification. Yes. I was interested in the sort of, I suppose, spatial metaphor you produced earlier of the confessional.
Yeah.
And while all this is happening, I mean, just to return briefly for this topic, I mean, the Zoom format does feel a little bit like a confessional.
It's a good example because certainly for teaching, which is what we do, we are teachers now, we are teaching in Zoom, and there's so little problem that we have to be a little bit concerned about our old fantasies about the superimportance of being in a space. Right. And of a particular building. In other words, so Zoom in a way poses a challenge to education because it works not only so smoothly, but there are certain, let's say, anti-hierarchical dimensions to it. Literally, there's no one student sits closer to you than any other. And,
absolutely, yeah.
And the image of the teacher is no different than the image of the student.
Right.
On the other hand, it's a totally corporate environment in which the only two reactions you're allowed to have is either thumbs up or applause. So this is even more a kind of compulsory euphoria than our corporations normally offer. But nevertheless, of course, you're right. There is again the sense of the confessional, and I think of the confessional as, of course, is a kind of space within a space, right? A small box inside a larger box, in which two people sit very, very close together. I mean, I don't play for any religious team, so I never had this experience. But what I observe from the outside is that two people sit extremely closely together and have an extremely intimate conversation. But the purpose of that conversation could be understood almost in viral terms as an attempt to decontaminate the public space. That is to say, I unleash all of my secrets and my guilt to somebody who promises to keep that secret. A kind of a hard drive, a kind of personal hard drive, I dump in order that I am somehow cleansed and returned to the public field. So you could say it also maps onto our current situation where it's a kind of architecture of purification and decontamination and cleansing. And on this point, I again feel, since what's happening now is a kind of reinforcement. It's as if the world that we live in is in the same typeface, but maybe it's in bold. It just has become slightly bolder. Everything, every letter seems to have shape. Every building, every person, every comment, and so on. But actually, the overall structure, the language, and what is being said is the same. So, if there is this moment, let's say, in which everything is somehow in bold, what we are seeing is actually the world that we have always been living in. And I love the Marshall McLuhan idea that the present is far too shocking to face, and that we see the world in the rearview mirror. So I feel in this moment we see the world that we have been living in. And if architects imagine themselves somehow aimed towards the future, I think a discussion about what's happening now is precisely not a discussion of the future, but a discussion of our history.
Right.
And it's a long history.
So, but it's a kind of a, objects in the mirror are closer than they appear kind of a rear view mirror, It's also this magnification that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is that how you feel, let's say, if you don't mind me asking, emotionally, kind of like your seeing yourself in magnification in some sense, in your own history or your own life? I mean, you were talking about earlier in the sort of a preliminary, we were talking about ghosts of our fathers and things like that. Yes. Are you doing any of that?
Yes, I think, firstly, I would say I would be the least reliable witness of myself. Which might just be another way of repeating McLuhan's claim. Like if we cannot see the current situation, only, let's say, perhaps we cannot see ourselves, but only what we have been or what others have told us we have been. But in this moment of magnification, yes, I think the day seems very short, and for me that speed is again evidence that everything is a little bit in hyperfocus, so things move with a kind of clear rhythm. But I think I mean it in the two senses. One, what you say, like, yes, it's a moment of reflection. This is why, again, I think that if the scholar is a kind of a person of reflection, a reflector, both internally and also reflecting to others, to our students, to our readers, the world, it could be that a reflector or somebody that reflects has very little wisdom about themselves. Possibly, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's say.
I mean, there's a relationship between blindness and insight. But
Yeah.
It's a constitutive relationship.
Yes. I'm somebody, for example, who feels much more comfortable in an airplane than I do on the ground. And now daily life is something like being in an airplane, right? You cannot, in the airplane, if you go outside, it's the end.
Right.
So we are a little bit in that way of being. So actually, for me, I'm almost designed for the situation. So it plays also into all of my Anglo-Saxon repressions that everything is just fine, actually. But every now and then comes a wave of, let's say, each day there is a moment in which there is a wave of melancholy. And Beatrice and I, we walk the city every day looking for, let's say, evidence of ourselves, of the world that we are living in. And this is a very, very quiet city. This is a ghost town. So we walk through a ghost town in which, let's say, a town the whole world is watching, but there's actually nothing to see or even to hear since it's so quiet. So I think there is, let's say, all of these are the conditions that we normally associate with the scholar. You know, the scholar is somehow in a quiet place, a place of reflection and a place of disconnection. So what's interesting here, it seems to me, everybody placed into this position of detachment, which we have always claimed as a kind of a privilege. And what a privilege it is to teach in a university, to be detached, to be literally paid to be a bit disconnected, a bit irresponsible, a bit impractical, a bit less useful for the present, but somehow potentially useful in some future or even some past. I mean, maybe the scholar is a kind of retroactively useful person in the same way that, for example, you have affected the student the most when they realize 10 years later that something that happened between you was a huge resource for them. So exactly the beauty of teaching is that it doesn't happen in the moment of teaching, that the teacherly moment again is some kind of retroactive thing. So when a whole community, when all communities are placed into this position of reflection, number one, and number two, have all the same technologies of communication, research, and information. In other words, everybody is also, in a certain sense, given all of the same tools and information. You have a kind of utopia similar to that dreamed of in the 1960s, where the computer and the telecommunications and two-way television and so on would make possible a society that would have no need of politicians, for example, because politicians are simply organizing wars, and wars we only have, again, getting back to Buckminster Fuller would say we only have wars because we have the mistaken idea that we don't have enough resources, and we only have politicians to manage wars. So if we actually would have all the communication channels, then we could collectively move resources. We would share, and then when we would share, we wouldn't need politicians and we wouldn't need wars. So this idea of a kind of mass communication society, okay, we are now right in the middle of it. Even the Zoom education, of course, this is something dreamed of by educational philosophers since the Second World War. Of course, since the time of those great utopian fantasies about what we would now think of as the sort of information age, we have learned that information age is not an egalitarian nirvana of resource sharing, but is a much more efficient extractive system that the information economy has reinforced every prejudice, all of the right-wing populisms, all of the stratifications, and so on. So here's the interesting thing: we are all now occupying a kind of social structure, a system of communication, and by which I mean not just, let's say, people, but also objects, protocols, animals, technologies, and spaces, and so on. We now occupy what was thought to be a kind of utopia, and yet we have learned that it is not in any way a utopia. And the question is, can we think our way out of it? So, for example, with Zoom, could one think beyond the fantasies of the 60s in Zoom? And I must say, I am skeptical. I feel there will have to be the invention of many different tools of communication. But perhaps we have left out the most important point, is that cities and houses, buildings, have always been organized by epidemics. We live in a kind of medical instrument already, right? It's designed by previous dramas like this. But when we are inside this drama, we pretend that it is the first time. We even hear leaders saying, "We could not imagine this." So here's the amazing thing. This is why I'm a bit skeptical also about the dreams of the future. Because every time there is an emergency, a quote-unquote emergency, a medical emergency, yes, it is an architectural emergency, and it has specific architectural consequences. And we live in, as it were, we live inside the archaeology of all the accumulated consequences of all the previous dramas like this. But almost every time the knowledge is forgotten. Almost every time. And you can go all the way back. I give you a small example. You know, the white walls of modern architecture are directly coming from the sanitary reform movement of the 19th century. But the call for white, and a smooth white, and for the whitewash, is already in and the beginning of so-called contact tracing is the end of the 18th century. Already you have this in the face of epidemics.
Contact tracing?
At the very end of the 18th century, you have what would now be thought of as contact tracing. That is to say, you have a doctor who's following every single patient, who's touching every single patient. And in the big argument that's going on, whether disease is coming through the air or through touch, there's always been these two sides of the argument. Now, if you follow the history of whitewashing, which, as you know, is something I'm obsessed with.
Of course.
This history goes back through 19th century sanitary engineering, where the English were playing an incredibly important role. But then you get back to Italy, and then you get back to 15th century, 14th century. And then when you're in the 14th century, you have requirements that every house with disease to be whitewashed and cleaned, to be ventilated regularly, and so on. You have basically all the same protocols. And what I've noticed in the history of, let's say, whitewash, it's a history in which the knowledge gets, as it were, endlessly rediscovered. There's nothing said by the English about the whitewash and cleaning and ventilation and so on that was not already said in the face of all the plagues before. Mm-hmm. So then I become fascinated by why is it that we live inside the kind of literal aesthetic, you know, the white aesthetic that we think to be modern, why we live inside this kind of response to epidemic, and we naturalize it so that it doesn't seem to be a response to epidemic. It doesn't seem to be historical. We even think of the white wall as somehow sort of trans-historical, modern in the sense of being still fresh, you know, like it's the very image of freshness. Somebody says, I want to freshen up my house. Maybe they paint it white. So this leads me to think that there will be some short-term specific architectural consequences of this outbreak. They are very likely to be repetitions of similar strategies from the past, and they are very likely to be forgotten so that an epidemic can hit again. Right. And this leads to a kind of final thought, right, which just occurs to me when talking to you. If we are with Freud for a bit, nothing gets forgotten, let's say, accidentally.
Right.
It's a hard work to forget. So then the question is why? And why would we like architecture to be both a defense against disease, but also something that is at any moment able to be terrorized by disease? Like, why is architecture both the image of defense and the image of the victim?
I don't know. I mean, I think to stay with Freud, we repeat things again and again because we are acting out, right?
Right.
and acting out is a technology for us to survive. Survive any trauma, you act out some kind of an old repression, and then at least you said your piece.
Right.
But the repressions remain, as you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
And I was struck by your description of New York. I imagine you and Beatrice walking the streets and these empty streets. So instead of the white walls, there is this white noise, in a sense,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And there's this white noise kind of inside the place, which is sort of a no place, as you're describing it.
Yes.
So the question is, you said perhaps we can talk our way out of it, So I'm thinking the talking cure, right? I mean, can we talk our way out of this, or do you have to sort of like produce our way out of it? I mean, do you have to make some kind of a performance or do some kind of a emotional piece which can, sort of sublate our repressions in some way? Maybe it's a repetition again and again. Maybe we are seeing the sort of a modernist syndrome again and again. I describe myself as a kind of a recovering modernist. Mm-hmm. Totally subscribed to Modernists Anonymous, which basically means that while I'm talking about deconstructing my way through modernism, I'm also planning my next modernist fix while I'm talking about it. Right.
Right.
So if that's the situation roughly that we are sort of repeating ourselves in, and if we are skeptical about utopias today, yesterday, and tomorrow, there nevertheless must be some, let's say pedagogies, schools of architecture, ways of teaching, ways of thinking, ways of working that can help us better work through this situation. I mean,
yeah. So I think that if what I was saying before has some value, it would suggest that the productive move is to look back at what were the urgencies that we didn't pay close attention to before this happened. In other words, I don't see the current situation as the source of anything other than cruelty. To be clear, the current situation is there is a national debate going on about eugenics, but it does not use that name. But you have on one side an appeal for everybody to stay home because many people are dying, and great sadness that those people who are dying are people of missed opportunity and of color. There is the opposite argument, is that we must get out, and there's no problem to get out because the people who will die are people of missed opportunity and color. So basically there is a eugenics argument that says, in fact, we at some level will purify our genetic pool by having large amounts of people die. To which there is the counter argument that says this is our greatest fear and no life can be sacrificed. But nobody dares use the name eugenics, but it could even be that a national election will be debated without using that word, but that is the word. And I certainly...
that's frightening, is it not?
Yeah, and I think it's extremely frightening and extremely... it is the exact product of our current situation. Right, the debate between lockdown and liberation is really all about, do you care about the people who are dying, and specifically, do you care about the types of people who are dying? And these two discourses almost never intersect. I've been absolutely struck by the lack of discussion in television and so on, literally connecting these 2 points, that the call for liberation coincides with the statistical demonstration of who it is that is dying. And I think that the terms of the current debate are toxic, I would say, for both sides. So in a way, for me, better to try to find, let's say, an earlier point. And for me, that point lies in the almost urgent need to develop a kind of a concept of sort of trans-species hospitality. Like part of the dilemma, I don't simply mean because the virus arrives to the so-called human via animals, but it is part of the story. But let's say, inasmuch as architecture, the field of architecture, preserves an idea of the human as a distinct kind of animal that is protected from an outer world by architecture, that architecture essentially has the role of a kind of prophylactic defense, which is why it has played such a role in this medical and every medical drama. as long as we preserve this idea, I'm not so sure, number one, whether that human is worth saving, because that human is
as a singular entity.
As a singular entity. Yeah, that seems to me a kind of proto-extractive figure. So this protected figure inside the home is protected always in the knowledge that there are unprotected people that are literally slaves of the one protected. So I feel like this idea of protecting let's say the human is directly associated with, in fact, the vast majority of humanity being not only unprotected, but being wounded and extracted by this gesture.
Are you including like non-human actors in this?
Yes,
You're talking about animals, you're talking about all species and
computers,
transhumanism.
Protocols, proportional systems, codes, languages, and so on. In other words, and let's say, as Beatrice and I tried to do with the Are We Human project, let's just start with the basic idea that what we call human is a bag of bacteria. The majority of the human body is bacteria. Those bacteria, many of them have lived 100,000 or so. Many of them have lived for millions of years, long before the arrival of the human. So what we call human is, let's say, more like a city. It's a kind of collaborative infrastructure of a wildly diverse and independently evolving, what Donna Haraway would call companion species, perhaps.
Sure, right, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you say to rethink the human from this point of view, actually the health of that being depends not on isolation from the world, but engagement, collaboration, negotiation, and so on. So if one rethinks the human as firstly not in any moment independent, no one human ever possible to be separated from any other human, and no human being, let's say, one unto itself, being massively. Think, for example, of a room. A room is absolutely filled with the bacteria that are passing in and out of your body, but also the bacteria of plants and animals and the outside and so on. And this is absolutely, your health depends on this. So if we return to this question of let's say, a healthy space, let's say a healthy space would be a space of contamination and cross-fertilization and so on. And if one would imagine what would be the architecture that's associated with this kind of ethics of cross-species, I suppose in what I'm saying is a kind of political claim that if one was to be and feel an urgent political responsibility to those that suffer in the current world as they have suffered for thousands of years, if one really cares about that, one has to move beyond the human. To say it another way, the human is famously inhumane. Nothing is more brutal than this figure. Now, if you develop this other kind of viewpoint, then you could have a discussion of lockdown or not that is a bit more complicated than which humans are to be protected and which humans are, quote unquote. It's interesting that it is the essential that die. As professors, we are perhaps about to
be not very essential.
Not very essential, but somewhere we are. I think the greatest insult is that we are neither essential nor not essential. You know, it's the value. Our value is yet to be determined, and perhaps we could treasure that. But I think that if you think through from this kind of trans-species position, and then think about, let's say, a virus, because of course I ruthlessly follow all of the guidelines and all of the protocols. Yeah, I'm not yet willing to experiment with. I'm not, as one doctor said the other day, you don't want to know what this virus will do to you. Of course, I'm very curious, but I think he's right that I don't want to find out. Right. But let's say for now, I try to defend. I try to prevent that experiment using all of the, let's say, the classical techniques that are coming from hundreds of years, in which. They would not have used the word social distance. By the way, that seems like a contradiction in terms, and certainly Beatrice is from Spain. The idea of social and distance, these are the opposite concepts. Social means lack of distance. So
the English would have no problem with that.
Yeah,
they know exactly.
So social distance requires a kind of repressive Anglo-Saxon environment, which is my own.
Very comfortable, yes.
Yeah, you and I as colonial figures, we can do that.
Yeah.
But probably some other kind of logic will emerge. And I think the logic is something to do with breathing. For example, I think breathing is a very good idea. Like if you don't do it, you die. And what is breathing? Breathing is really bringing into your inside the outside. More than that, you make your inside out of the outside. This is also a way to. So if you think of a kind of breathing as important, you don't always breathe in, but sometimes you breathe in and then you breathe out. I could see that there can be an architecture that will breathe in this other sense, that there will be moments where it's useful to not be exposed. And another moment where exposure is really crucial,
Well, straightforwardly, I mean, it points in the direction of undoing the entire legislature of thinking sustainability through closed envelopes and I mean, there has to be a completely different understanding of what it means to live, whatever you want to call it, ecologically, sustainably through trans-species kind of a worldview, right? I mean, this makes for a very different envelope or lack of it. Yeah. I mean,
and so exactly. So we can then look into the history of our field for those architects and those architectures or anti-architectures that offer us some models for how architecture can breathe, where breathing would be understood as a social act, like a building that is able to close off and then open. When it opens, it is also taking a risk. It is inviting the stranger in. It is.
Well, the idea of inoculation has always been that. I mean, vaccines work through that concept.
Yeah.
But somehow that has not inoculated architecture, so to speak.
No.
So why is that? Is that a sort of our repression from always cities being sites of defense, at least in the Western Civ, through a city by definition is, the not barbarian, right? Is that what it is all about?
It's a great question. I don't know. I love New York, and of course we come to New York to be contaminated. Like I coming from New Zealand, right? If I walk 100 meters in New Zealand, I will see 3 cows, 100 sheep, and my grandfather. If I walk 100 meters in New York City, there's the possibility of microtransactions with about 1,000 people. I can choose to not transact. So in a way, the very purpose of cities is contamination. This is the schizophrenia we talked about before. A city is designed to connect, but is also every visible structure we see is designed for disconnection. So there is, let's say, already a breathing going on. New York City is a combination of isolated, well-preserved, and protected cells in which its occupants want to be outside and to contaminate each other. Right? They don't want to be in the fields. They don't want to be in. So, of course, not by chance, this vote for lockdown versus open up coincides with urban versus rural. Rural says open up, city says lockdown. So there's let's say a different philosophy of breathing. But let's say we try to think of an architecture of breathing. Yeah. And where breathing is understood as kind of taking the risk of the stranger, of bringing the outside in, of encouraging mutation, contamination, and so on. But breathing also means alternatively treasuring what comes inside. Like perhaps the stranger you bring in, you offer asylum, for example, right? Right. So if you think of this architecture of breathing, of course there can be many different concepts of breathing that coincide. I mean, it would not be that there'd be some unique form of architecture which is a kind of breathing architecture that we should all move to. And this is a little bit my fear of the sustainability discourse, because the sustainability discourse is religion. Yeah, it is filled with a sense of its own goodness and its own virtue. I think that the advantage of the discourse around the virus is that it's very difficult to assume a position of virtue. But let's imagine that the city dweller has a different concept of breathing than the rural. Like there are actually two competing philosophies of breathing, and this makes me think again of Buckminster Fuller. Fuller said that architecture was a valve. that it will, for example, keep the rain out, but keep all the electronic signals in. So he had a kind of idea of radical promiscuity of information and an absolute lack of promiscuity around the human body. In fact, he was a germaphobe. Extreme.
He was a germaphobe?
Extreme germaphobe.
He traveled all over India under Indira Gandhi. I don't know, how did he...
He traveled everywhere, had sex with everyone and everything, and yet had great difficulty sharing a toilet with his wife, and a lifelong fear of being infected through the toilet. Hence his becoming the head of sanitary design engineering for 3 years at the leading toilet designer and manufacturer in the United States, and why he designed the Dymaxion bathroom as a kind of spaceship to guarantee that he would never be infected from the outside. And he refused the idea of plumbing connecting. So he had the idea that plumbing belongs to socialism, that to have your house connected to the toilet of the next house was basically to live in Russia. Right. So you have an extreme American argument, right, which is that you live in your own isolated bubble, and yet at the same time you're hyper connected to every other bubble.
Right.
So not so different from the world we live in now, where we have all been trained to be germaphobes. We have all become Zoomophiles, and we are all receiving masses of information. But it is interesting. I think we could revive a little bit, not Fuller's germophobia, but this idea of breathing, this idea of a valve, this idea of a kind of pulsating architecture. 2 points on that. This doesn't mean like 1960s jellyfish. Maybe it would be more, because you and I as historians and theorists, we could say, why don't we try to understand the way that architecture is already breathing, right? Already, this is of course why modern architecture became super unhealthy. It was not breathing, right? It was a prophylactic. Yeah. It did the air, and as we know, houses creak and stretch and strain and leak, and there's all sorts of fluids. The microbiome of architecture is rich and complex and historical. So if we could just start to understand the way in which architecture is already continually pulsating and breathing, seems to me we then position ourselves to think about something like a pandemic differently. It's a different kind of, or at least let's say the moment of pulling up our defenses might be followed by a compulsory undoing of defenses. Like, couldn't there be, for example, a presidential order that would come after the vaccine has been developed, which almost requires a kind of opening up to other species and to other ethnicities, other philosophies, other biologies? Like, wouldn't there be, let's say, in the interests of social health, a kind of call for another kind of way to live together, right? A kind of, let's say, in other words, getting back to the forgetting, normally what happens is we presuppose our current situation is healthy, and then the situation of the disease is unhealthy. But of course, philosophies of health are not about sick versus healthy, but about opportunities. The healthy person is not somebody who has no disease, but it's about what are the opportunities.
Right. I mean, there's the sort of this description of architecture in a kind of a mechanical way as technologies of breathing, but also I was talking to Rachel Armstrong. And she, I think the phrase that we came up with was probiotic architectures. Thinking of architecture itself not as a sort of a mechanical device of some kind, but thinking of the entire organism of the building, of the city, and us, everything in a way as a technology of probiosis,
Yeah. This is a lovely thought. I love her way of saying it. I think this is, I would add only just a repetition that I see this as a fundamentally political way of thinking, or let's say an urgently political way of thinking. Recently, before the pandemic, interestingly enough, Beatrice and I were writing about the architecture of bacteria and kind of recentering architecture around bacteria. So in that context, let's say a probiotic architecture makes perfect sense. But again, I think if you place bacteria at the center of architectural conversations, before you discuss human, not human, just say, let's talk bacteria, a vastly different, let's say, sort of political philosophy is immediately engaged. And if you look at the history of our field, it's a history of nervousness about bacteria.
Yes, that's right.
So it's not just that we normally think of the human as the center, not bacteria, but the anti-bacteriological impulse is as old as the very word bacteria and the discovery of bacteria. So again, I think I find a bit annoying in the current situation that the expectation that we could know what comes next. It seems to me the future is, by definition, what we don't know will come next. Like anything that happens that we thought it was going to happen, that's not the future. That's just what we thought.
The Lavenir,
The future is that which happens that we didn't expect. So anybody that answers the question, like, what is the future going to be, is an idiot. Or let's say anybody who listens to the answer is an idiot.
Yeah.
But it seems to me where the surprises might occur, or where we are most easily surprised, is in the biological. Despite all the metaphors of architecture and biology and so on, there is a kind of nervousness in our field about the biological, and specifically the bacteriological, even before we speak of the virus.
Why is that? What's the history of that? Why are we so particularly nervous about that?
I think because architecture is classically thought of as offering, for the longest time, let's say in the West, images of stability and certainty that do not remove uncertainty but act as its kind of cover. Like a gravestone appears to be clear and still and simple, when in fact what it marks is exactly the thing we never ever can understand, right? So death, right? So what if architecture operates the same way, that it is always it's an inverse symptom. Architecture is a confident statement made exactly where we have our greatest fear. So one answer to your question is architects are extraordinarily afraid of bacteria because bacteria refuse to follow any architectural rules. Exactly what they do is slide in and out. Like, what is a wall to a bacteria? Nothing. Or an opportunity. Right, so bacteria is almost like the image. It's almost like a visceral image of what the architect thinks that they are resisting. Even before, they don't even have to use the word bacteria, but whatever architecture is, it's not like a bacteria. That is to say, it's not invisible. And think about it. Ever since classical Greek architecture, architects are called on or claimed to represent the invisible, like the logic of the universe and so on, and represented it as something reassuring and transhistorical and reinforcing of the human. But if the invisible world is a world of bacteria and a world of information and a world of big data hacking and so on, if this invisible world that we inhabit actually refuses any of the lines that architects draw, there's an incredible professional embarrassment. And this embarrassment is even greater than the embarrassments that we feel about radio and television, all those other things that refuse to respect architecture, right? So of course, what I'm saying is that I do think that the bacteriological and then the viral, but let's at least say bacterial, is a way to place the architectural conversation in a different space. But this is something I would have said and did say and I'm still saying before this, during this, and after this. So it's not so much like, okay, I think we need to do this in response. I think that our field, let's say architectural scholarship, is at its weakest when it claims to be responding to the virus, right? Because I think I think our responses medically should be understood as symptoms. Like if you were to analyze the virus, you could say, okay, here's all the things that happen. And one of the symptoms was architectural scholars started saying things like X. So, of course, it's very, very interesting what architects are saying, but it's not interesting because of the content of what they're saying, but let's say So I feel like right now our behavior, let's say, is symptomatic and could be analyzed and might be treatable. Like, in other words, there might be other
placebo.
ways. Yeah, there may be other forms that scholarship and intellectual life in architecture or around architecture could take place. And this is something would be very exciting. So I think if the virus managed to, even just for a few months, make some of our stupidity seem stupid, then it will have performed quite a positive cleansing function. But I have to say, in this moment, I don't have reason for optimism. Like, I feel both in the architectural community and in the wider world, I see the worst, the most murderous ideas are sort of smuggled inside what seems to be a warm, soft, sensitive, caring humanism. And I think humanism is a killer. All the typical symptoms that we dehumanize those that we wish to hurt or that we are afraid of, all of the making animal of those we don't want to share with. This is all happening at the most in the most spectacular way. So to return to where our conversation began, if this is a moment of looking in the mirror and a moment in which you said very beautifully, things actually appear a little bit bigger, a little bit clearer, a little bit sharper, and that image is retroactive, like that we are kind of looking at what we were before the virus, and we're seeing it with great clarity. It's not a pretty thing that we are seeing. It is something quite disturbing, and that seemed to me acts as a call for architects to think differently. It's not a call for them to think in a particular way, and I think as teachers this is not our role to point east and say go east and use this, but is to sort of offer our support and encouragement and criticism to those that start the project of thinking differently, and I think that the forces of normalization are massively assembled right now, even under the name the new normal. Why would we ever aspire to anything like a new normal? And does anybody really think that the new normal is not murderous in its basic organization? What they mean, I suppose, and maybe I'm exaggerating, Vikram, but do they mean a new normal which would be a normal in which we could be extremely cruel without acknowledging that fact for long periods of time? In other words, a normal in which we don't provide health care to our fellow citizens, right? Just that's normal. That's what they mean by a new normal. A new normal is just like cruelty needs a new package. And I say this in these very exaggerated terms because you said before, like, do you find yourself like looking at your own work and your own responsibilities and so on? And I think yes. I think for me personally, I feel it gives great urgency to not to what we have been doing, but what we might try to do.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, that's extremely important. I mean, the last time we had a pandemic and a major financial crisis, we had World War II at the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's what happens if, which is not to say that those were exceptional bracketed circumstances. They were sort of a heightening of the kinds of conditions which were already in play, and they were but there is deep danger in situations like this, I feel. And so as teachers, let's say, it is extremely important for us to cultivate the importance of thinking not normally, as you're saying. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it becomes very important. It's a political job. I mean, it's not. It needs to be pushed quite significantly. I mean, the discourse in the university right now is falling enrollments, loss of revenue. Planning to shift to Zoom versus this. Whereas it seems to me, in some ways, the seminar room has become more important than ever.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think actually I thought that Donald Trump was very good for university teaching, because everybody, teacher and student, has been scared shitless, and so every conversation in the seminar room is somehow precious, because we all feel the world falling apart, and then now it is falling apart, as if A leads to B, and you're exactly right. The seminar room becomes maybe has always been a seminar room being neither, let's say, the lecture room where information is coming down in a more hierarchical way, the seminar room more social, more collaborative, more horizontal. Let's say in architecture versus the studio, where perhaps work becomes again more independent and more authorship. The seminar room as a kind of intermediate between the knowledge of the teacher and the new knowledge emerging in the students. And my own view is that as a teacher, what we try to do is nurture and support the ideas that the students haven't had yet, and probably won't have until they long after they leave the room. So we kind of offer a kind of stupidity reduction, which I think is a hugely important, because this helps the students. It reduces their chances of just wasting time, because you can kill off a lot of stupidities. And our field has a stockpile of stupidities that I think I think there are wonderful. I really feel great about architectural scholars these days, because there are so many and so good and so many new voices. But we need this army to chip away at this stockpile of stupidity and make it crumble a bit, so that the new ideas will flourish, and that can. This is a moment for that. And I would say the virus is a very good way of making clear that most of what we talk about in architecture is stupid. Like, most of the claims we make are irresponsible, are kind of wishes. Most of what we say, you know how Trump is always saying, it's a miracle, it would just sort of disappear. Well, at some level, the way architectural teachers always talk is sort of like, somehow there is this mythical, magical thing called architecture, which will somehow save the day, miraculously. So I think since so much of what we do in architecture have sort of happy thoughts in a sad world, in a way, architecture is a kind of. I never met an architect without optimism. Optimism seems to be one of the congenital features of the architect. Doctors don't have optimism, lawyers don't have optimism. Nobody who thinks has optimism. So the architect is somebody who actually finds a way not to think about the fact that everything is so bad, and imagines that actually there are a few things that can be done that would make for a better society. Also, architects always think that everything they do, no matter how small, is viral, like it's congenital. Like if you do a perfect doorknob, everybody's life improves, right? So here you have the species of the architect, not human, similar to human, very visually similar, but quite distinct species, that has an amazing asset, which is, I would say, optimism and also promiscuity. Architects combine ideas that illegitimately, they just have no shame and are therefore called on by society to act in situations where society doesn't even know how to think. They don't even. It's not a question of knowing what to build. It's not even knowing what the question is. So when society doesn't know what the question is, it invites in this sort of optimistic, promiscuous, sort of multi-dimensional thinker, the person who can think when no one else can think, to see if they can say what is the question. And so I think architects have a historical role of framing questions in moments in which even the possibility of a question seems unclear. So when I say that there's a lot of nonsense in architecture, the kind of wishful thinking, this has to be, I suppose, understood as part of our charm, part of what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to offer magic. And as a hugely repressive person myself, I'm a deep believer in the need for a kind of image that everything's okay. I don't want to be in the depths of my anxieties, right?
Yeah, you don't want to be in the downer business. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we can, as teachers, we have then this double responsibility to, on the one hand, remove as much stupidity as we can, but not in the name of reason or logic or clarity or precision, but in the name of helping to incubate new unreasonable potentials of thinking. Because I suppose you agree, but I very much have the view that the architect, she's an intellectual, right? Architects are intellectuals. This is why the virus may have impacted the professional lives of architects, let's say in the more kind of classical sense of making buildings and so on, but in no way has impacted the intellectual responsibilities and urgencies of architects. And we do have every reason to believe that somehow out of this, kind of professional pause comes really, very insightful and inspiring and or controversial or wild, or things will happen. And this for me is very exciting. So in general, I feel like if architects blow this opportunity, then we should just turn out the lights. I mean, I really think our field is designed for such a moment in which the terms are unclear, the stakes are extremely high, but this is our moment as teachers, as intellectuals, but also as professionals. And historically, the track record is good. Historically, in the face of major medical disasters, there have been enormously interesting work and ideas coming from architects. So this is the side of me that feels optimistic. I'm super pessimistic, let's say, about the real world. Everything I've never seen a darker picture. So, ergo, architecture is perfect. That's our moment.
Got it. Mark, with that, I'm going to join you in the project of thinking about this future. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
It's a real pleasure to see you again. Lovely to see your face too.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.